Great, thank you. Thanks for the warm introduction. So prepare to be moderately entertained through philosophy and buzzwords. All right, didn't work too well. Okay. All right, so I'll be talking a lot more about philosophy. I don't have any fancy PowerPoint presentations. I think we lose a lot of the essence of what I'm going to be talking about, which is planning and exercise as we go through best cases. So I'll talk a lot about more philosophy. I will put in buzzwords as well. So here's a picture of an EOC. So how many people have actually worked in an EOC, been involved in an EOC? I think most of you have, right? In emergency management. I can tell you that in 2017, as I was a planning chief of the National Response Coordination Center, working through hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, that was my longest activation, right? About 60 days, and then I went to Puerto Rico afterwards. The takeaway I got from that is a good breeding ground for germs. The planning section, we generated, besides pushing all the information and resources, we started to generate at about day 40 cases. And so we had our chief medical officer, Doc McIntyre, there, and he started to do an epidemiological study on the EOC, and we're trying to figure out where people were getting sick, and it came to be that the whole NRCC was potentially contaminated by the planning section. So good breeding ground for germs. So normally, outside of pushing germs, we push information, right? We've also pull requirements from states and locals, and then we execute programs through waivers. We grant waivers, we track resources using WebEOC or some sort of tracking tools. Obviously, we work through ICS or a hybrid of ICS through NIMS, right? Filling out 204s, 205s, 215s, 207s, and so on and so forth. And that's great and all. However, the whole system of an EOC is designed to pull information, right? It's designed to generate requirements. The Stafford Act, right? We take requirements that are validated by the states and locals, we process that, and we push out resources or information for coordination. And that's what the EOC does, okay? And in some ways, very in a chaotic moments, right, the best thing to do is looking at principles to utilize simplicity, right? It's so when things are confusing, things are overwhelming, high degree of uncertainty, lots of things going on, simplicity is the best method to execute. And that's great, but we can do better, right? And that's one of the reasons why planning and exercises is designed. It's an amplification of best practices. So in an EOC, as we go through generating the forms, the ICS forms, I think of using technology, and that's the whole purpose of this conference and the summit, to do better, right? We use personal phones from our day-to-day aspect. We use technology, but that doesn't translate necessarily into the disaster management field. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and why we do that. I think one of the reasons why we still revert back to simplicity and revert back to some of the old methods is because we don't have a methodology to execute one of the principles for that, right? So as important as situational awareness is to understand what the problem is, I think we have to understand, more importantly, how do we actually structure an unstructured problem? How do we actually provide mechanisms to do a collective decisive action or unified effort from a collective standpoint? And that's the key. So I propose that operational planning is that methodology, right? ICS planning is generated by requirements. They go through Planning P, which is more project management. But how do you take outside your normal traditional response when you have an event that exceeds your capacity? How do we take that unstructured problem set or ill-structured problem set and we structure that? And to me, planning is one way of doing it. Exercise it is a mechanism to enforce it. But operational planning is that methodology. In a normal sense, if you look at unstructured problem, that's what disaster managers kind of gravitate towards. We look at complexity, we look at complicated things, and we delve towards that uncertainty. It's more of an intrigue to us than normal, which may be a problem or may not be a problem. It's a problem trait to some. So if the requirements are unclear, right, such as a large disaster, how do we actually start managing that? And what if at the states and locals, from a vertical integration standpoint, what if that becomes an issue in that they can't articulate what the requirements are, right? If everything's uncertain, where do you start? How do you start to prioritize? So how do you start to forecast out what the problems can be from a disaster management side? And that's kind of where I'd like to see where planning should be going towards. So the way that we look at operational planning, we do it by two methods. We look at conceptual planning, where we use a lot of design, visioning, and then add the prescriptive elements towards that. That's a little bit different from the traditional ICS plannings, where the requirements are fed up to us. Because in a big disaster, catastrophic disaster, you're going to have to start to forecast a little bit further out and be comfortable with the uncertainty. So the end result from a planning perspective is that you're going to have to look at or value critical thinking versus project management when you're looking at operational planning. Because you've got the design piece as well as the prescriptive planning piece. So why am I talking to you about philosophy on this? Because my vision is to utilize the best practices, just like what the other speakers have done previously, use the technology to start to formulate that structured environment where we can just start to execute properly. We can maximize things. And I would say technology is the greatest enabler for planning to do this. We have to, but first we have to go beyond over-articulating the obvious. Great tools that we have from a technology standpoint, but in some cases, it does over-articulate the obvious. And so what we need to do is go beyond that. How do we actually apply resources? How do we actually apply financial aspects? How do we better do operational coordination? That, to me, is how technology can start to enable some of those actions. And we have to evolve and utilize those tools so that way we can actually start to embrace technology and complexity. So from my perspective, in an emergency management standpoint, we need to be better disaster managers, vice emergency managements, folks, right? So think about that. We need to manage disaster pre, during, and post versus just in the crisis action area, okay? So where do we start? We start by articulating risk. So this is just one map of looking at some of the earthquake probabilities, okay? And that's great. We also know, I mean, New Madrid was a perfect example. We know that's a high-risk areas, okay? And that's good. And risk articulation is the first step to understand the situation. Okay, so we have produced plans that articulate the risk. We've got the Cascadia subduction zone, which is in its new rewrite. New Madrid we just finished. We also have improvised INDs, anthrax, severe weather, as well as hurricanes. So we've got all these plans, about 120 plans that we've developed that actually help articulate some of the risk. But we need to go beyond that. Okay, and we've exercised these plans like Shaken Fury based upon our plan, right? So this year it'll be binary blackout with regions 1 and 9, FEMA regions 1 and 9 with the NRCC. Next year it'll be the Wasatch earthquake fault. The year after that it looks like Cascadia. So these plan and exercise cycle as we go through, we'll be exercising an articulation of risk, okay? But when you're looking at disaster management, the risk articulation is one part. We got to start looking at the actions, right, to address the risk. I would say to do that, you have to look at supply chain theories, okay, as well as system analysis, understanding the interdependencies, and then look into crisis human behavior, because that's ultimately what's going to matter is to influence behavior, you're going to have to look at crisis human behavior. So you have to understand those three theories to apply that risk and do something about it. Because at the end of the day, you have to understand from a response perspective the flows of finance, flows of goods and services, the physical flows, as well as information. You have to do that to stabilize and transition out of response so we can go into recovery or reconstitution and back to steady state. Okay? All right. So where does planning fit into risk? So I show you this picture because that to me is what we are currently at. Okay, so we write all these big fancy plans, right? And most people don't read the plans. It's not intuitive to read through a FEMA plan. It's a 600-page Cascadia plan or a 300-page medical countermeasure plan. Who does that unless you're a graduate student or someone new that comes into the agency? You say, hey, read this plan. Or if you're prepping up for an exercise, they have to read the plan the day of the exercise starts. Okay? And generally the plans are written in very dry format, 8-point font, hard to read. So lessons learned, no one really reads the plan. And I want to change that. Okay? I want to change it so that way we're actually not focused on the plan itself, but the planning, right? And you guys heard the adage, right? The plan is not the end, it's the planning that's more value. So that's what we're trying to do. And so we do that in two ways. The first way is the deliberate side, right? It was mentioned before that taking the plan, like train as you fight, right? So you're exercising all the tools that you would normally use in a disaster during an exercise, during the planning, all the way to, if it does happen, disaster does happen, that you would actually use it during the disaster. And we want to do that. We want to take that same philosophy and apply it to planning, okay? So as we look at the new technologies, like the iPhone or your laptops, right? Any device that you have, we want to incorporate the planning elements into that. And how do you do that? That's through technology, all right? Because we can't rely upon traditional means to forecast requirements, right? We have to use the tool sets out there, all that information that's being pushed to us and pulled to us to do that critical thinking for decision making. So what's required to do that is a couple things. One is the scenario, which is the risk, and the other is to develop key assumptions, and that leads to forecasting. For us to be able to forecast out changes the game in disaster management, right? We can anticipate what the requirements are going to be. So in a big catastrophic event, when everything's a priority, we can start to prioritize based on need. Okay, but you can't do that without risk articulation and push out the supply chain aspects of goods and services, information, and finance. So here's supply chain theory, right? They're based on flows, physical, information, and finance, and that physical is the goods and services. So think back, right? And generally, emergency management is an up-and-coming, it's an immature discipline, right? So if you ask your kids or folks that want to go into the field, they say, hey, how did you get here? Well, I came from the military, I came from the law enforcement, first responder community. I just happened to be at FEMA's one of the recruiting events. That's how they get into it. There is no mature career path for disaster managers at this point. But to me, disaster management looks very similar to like supply chain, right? Managing the flow of information, managing flow of finance, managing flow of goods and services. So I've got more state experience than I do federal, and I've always thought FEMA was a big paycheck, a big checkbook, right? So to me, working in ops, it was more important to tap into that big paycheck, that finance flow, because I was pretty good at managing our traditional disasters. Okay? So we can't mistake ourselves in emergency management or disaster managers as first responders, even though we may wear the cargo pants, right, and boots in the EOC. We're not first responders, okay? And so we have to think differently. We have to push a premium on critical thinking, all right? And I akin emergency managers more towards project managers than I do managing the crisis itself. So I do think that emergency management, if you understand the flows, but finance, physical, and information, you can start to manage the disaster, okay? And of course, all is under the guise of customer service, right? The right place, the right time, the right delivery, right? That should be, as we're supporting the states and locals, that should be our philosophy, right? And you do that through supply chain principles, all right? So where does planning fit into all this? So planning, to me, fits into all this is when you do operational planning and you start to forecast outside of the normal O period, right? So, hey, this is a critical need, right? And get into that intelligence-driven operational decision-making cycle. So how do we enable that? For us, it's understanding that system science, it's understanding the supply chain can heavily influence individual and collective behavior, right? And managing risk communication. Because our elected leaders, that's kind of what they're concerned about, is that strategic communications, right? So that allows, so understanding this cycle here allows us to do a lot more better forecasting, more precision forecasting, but more importantly, it gets into decision science for disaster management. Okay. All right. So what does the future of operational planning looks like? It's definitely not producing volumes of books and plans. It's incorporating planning through the use of technology into collective unified action decision making. Okay, so I see a reduction of the planning section and the planning capabilities and being it residing into other functions, whether it be preparedness, operations, exercises. People can plan. Planning is not rocket science, right? So you take the methodology and you incorporate it and distribute it throughout the rest of the emergency management community. So that's the big change. Okay. The second big change is we want to learn from the private sector, right? All this operational planning and the supply chain principles are from the private sector. So I can see us evolving to something very similar to the enterprise resource planning, right? Things like Amazon, things like some of the third-party logistics providers, DHL. When they start to use some of their software principles under enterprise resource planning, customer relationship management, I can see some of that migrating towards emergency management because we're pushing out goods and services, we're pushing out information, and we're pushing out finance, and that's what they do in terms of flows. So those are the big things. But more importantly, we have to change culture. We have to embrace technology. We have to make sure that we're not producing the plans, but we're actually focusing on the planning and leveraging what we traditionally have, such as the technologies that we have right now. So we have to change our planning culture as well, and to incorporate exercises, right, to modeling simulation, to ensure that we can start to war game right before hurricane season, what our force layout looks like, right, using geospatial tools, right, through modeling simulation, but using that and building that into our DNA as we go through preparing for that, right? Because shared situational awareness is great, but shared situation without actual action or course of action or concept of support is sorely needed. So that's where I see us heading. Our planners are not going to be scribes, right? We're trying to get away from that. What we're trying to get to is looking at more forecasts, right? And hence, that intelligence-driven operational planning is going to be extremely critical for that. So with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, David. So we do have a couple of moments for any questions that folks may have for David with regards to planning exercises. I see we have one question right up here, Charlotte. Thank you.
What do you see as the role for the TIS and GISS positions on the task forces and the IMT?
In terms of what they would normally do in the future?
Paradigm on information and technology. How do you see those roles shifting?
So I see that as definite SMEs, but so in that aspect, I don't see it changing. What I do see changing is the planning community itself is getting more technological savvy rather than being managing meetings, leading the planning P process. They'd go into conceptual design and start to forecast forecast that out. So the GIS person, so from force structure standpoint, I would rather, so planning is both an art and a science. I would, at this point, rather have more folks that are heavily on the science piece, more analysts, versus the art of planning. So I see the bigger change in planning vice GIS.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? We have a couple of minutes here. Okay, we have one more question up here, Charlotte. Thank you.
So enterprise IT, the sizing, spreadsheets, what have you, to help you forecast need, and what do you see as some of those tools that we might be able to leverage or take technology, clearly doing spreadsheets, maybe not the new technology to be using to try and help that forecasting piece, and looking at all those elements that you're going to need to either additive or multiple effects to meet the resource need. You see any tools that you want to talk about?
I do. So one of the things that we'd like to change is the ability of the way that we write our plans. Like Annex B is intelligence, where all our information collection is being done, and we need to beef that up, right? Annex C is concept of support. We need to make sure that we got the right force laydown, and as well as Annex D, the sustainment piece. So for us, we need to do a better job taking our plans, right, the 600 pages, and geospatially code them. So one of the challenges that we have when the NRCC activates, National Response Coordination Center, is our force laydown. And it takes about a day at the quickest to do force laydown. Well, I can take a same map, because I know where the IMATs are, I can put a pin, right? So what if I took, let's say, for example, New Madrid, and I knew what my force laydown was, my branches and divisions, and I already have that, and I can pivot off of that, right? In a geospatial, in a technology platform, geospatially. Because right now, if you look at some of our plans, they're actually in a tabular form with US grid coordinates in it. So they have to read that where our potential ISBs are, instead of staging bases, and they have to actually plug it through. They have to manually hand jam it in. So what if the planners took that and actually put it into a geospatial technology platform, which the watch uses on a daily basis, right? So you don't have to adapt or you don't have to recreate. You just adapt from it. So that's how I see the evolution starting. Is get rid of the paper, put it into devices, right, that people use on a day-to-day basis.
It's a great example, David. We actually had a session, I believe it was yesterday, moving from binders to geo-enabled plans. So I know for some folks that were in that session, that's that translation that we're trying to make now, right? And I think we're still trying to figure that out as a community. I don't think we have a perfect solution yet, but I think we're getting a lot closer.
Yeah. So I see the GIS community, the planner should be your biggest customer base, because they're going to structure that unstructured problems, right? So the plan itself should not be an outcome, as the planners may think. It should be an output of the planning process, right? Right now, it's an outcome. All right, we're finished. Promulgation, a 600-page plan that no one will read. Not even the planners will read, right? Right? So most people, if you go to college, you get Cliff Notes, and you watch the movie, then you write your paper, or you take your instructor's notes. Okay, that's how people think. And people would rather watch, process information, right, geospatially or through pictures, right? That's how the Army thinks. Everything's written at the 8th grade level, right? Because it's very easy to digest. So we got to think of planning, and I got to think of planning, and we're trying to change that culture where the plan's not an outcome, it's an output. Yeah.
I think we have a couple of questions. Paul, right here in the plaid shirt. One second, Paul. Microphone. Thanks.
You say you have to change the culture of planning, and how do you see doing that, taking them from scribes and running meetings into technology, somewhat savvy people? Is that training? Is that exercises? Is that hiring? What do you think is the best
Yeah.
path to take?
Yeah, it's all the above. So Cotter's change management, for those of you who understood change management, you either kill everybody and start from scratch, right, which we can't do, right? HR will get into my knickers, or you do evolutionary step, and which is what, training exercises, right? Bringing folks that are new as well. But again, emergency management is still brand new. That when you say, hey, you go into emergency management, what do you want to be as an emergency manager, right? Well, they mistake it for first responders. Well, I want to be at the spot. No. You're going to sit at a keyboard and you're going to start typing things and you're going to provide reports, right? So it's all the above. So for us in planning, we've created a master planning practitioner program. This is in FEMA, and we're beta testing it, and we're trying to hopefully percolate down to the states. And we're putting critical thinking as a premium, right? So that way they can, because we want to be able to forecast out, right? So if you look at the private sector, the most highly paid folks are the forecasters, right? Whether it be in business, Google or Microsoft, or in big manufacturing, it's the production or the sales and marketing forecasters, right? Those they get paid that because they're looking at market conditions. The least paid are usually your materials management, your warehouses. I know because I was one, right? So that's kind of like the lower end in terms of sophistication. In emergency management, the opposite, right? The planners, they don't do forecasting. They're like, that's just planning. And the folks, the logisticians that move stuff and warehouse stuff, they're at the higher level. So it's actually reverse. It's an inverse, and we need to change that, right? So to answer your question, it's all of the above.
Thank you. I think we have one more question here in the second row.
I'll make a comment and then ask a question, if that's okay. You talked about the supply chain management and how Amazon and other big box stores manage their supply chain systems, and there's something to be learned from that, and I agree with that. But that goes beyond that. To get the help to right places is important, but as a part of FEMA's mission, it's also planning to make sure that those supply routes are open quickly so that those supplies can get to places without, the federal government having to send help. So I think that there's a complementary idea there. But my question is regarding the simulation and exercises. So in our lifetimes, we have seen many disasters here in the U.S., but I don't think we have seen a big disaster. So, in my mind, I categorize as like, small disasters, medium size, and large size disasters. And none of us has seen a, continental level or planets level disaster. So, as for planning and running these exercises, you mentioned some of the ones that you did this year and last year, and there's like a power outage, blackout coming up. But how prepared are we to a continental scale disaster that will affect everybody's life? Any idea of that?
Right. So catastrophic by definition is hard to measure and hard to measure the preparedness catastrophic. It's by definition by catastrophic. We don't know, right? It's a paradigm changer. So I don't think we'll ever be prepared for catastrophic events. I think what we need to be prepared for is to be able to manage resources. In order to do that, you need to be able to have good decision-making skills, right? So as we try to change planning from scribes, right, running the planning P, to forecasters, and we emphasize critical thinking skills, I think that allows us to better prioritize things. It's intelligence-driven. Take the data that you have, take the information, turn it into knowledge, right? And to be able to articulate that in a forecast. So that to me is the way. Because I don't think you can actually say, are we prepared for catastrophic? I don't think the government's built that way. I don't think private industry is not that. They're just in time, right? So you're not stockpiling things as well. So it's hard to say can we actually be prepared for a catastrophic? That's just very tough to do. But what we can do is to shorten the decision timelines, right? To be able to anticipate, and quite frankly, create a culture of preparedness by embracing uncertainty, right? Disaster managers gravitate to uncertainty. That's what they do, right? So.
Thank you so much, David. We appreciate it. So thank you.